It was a bright morning in the grand mansion of Mr. Richard Hale, one of the richest men in the city. The sun shone through the tall glass windows, lighting up the marble floors and gold-framed paintings that lined the hallways. Everything in the house had its place. The clocks ticked perfectly, the servants moved quietly, and breakfast was always served at exactly 8 o'clock. Richard liked things this way, calm, quiet, and controlled. He was a man who built his empire from nothing, and he believed that order was the secret to success. Every morning, he would sit in his office, read the financial reports, and drink his black coffee without sugar. His 10-year-old son, Ethan, would usually be in his study room with a private tutor, learning math or reading books. The mansion was large and beautiful, but it was also silent. Too silent. That morning, something unusual happened. As Richard walked down the hallway toward his office, he heard laughter. It was soft at first, but it grew louder. He stopped walking and frowned. Laughter was not common in his home. He followed the sound, and to his surprise, it came from Ethan's study room. Slowly, he walked closer and stopped outside the slightly open door. Inside, he saw a scene that made him blink twice. His son Ethan was sitting on the floor, not at his desk, and in front of him sat Lena, the maid's daughter. She was about the same age as Ethan, maybe a little older. Her dark hair was tied in a messy braid, and her simple clothes stood out against the expensive furniture. The two children were laughing together as Lena moved her hands in strange motions. Ethan copied her, his face full of focus and joy. Richard's first thought was confusion. What is she doing here? He wondered. Why is the maid's daughter in my son's study room? His second thought was anger. He paid good money for tutors and teachers, not for children of his staff to play with his son. But something about the scene made him pause. Ethan looked happy, genuinely happy. Something Richard hadn't seen in a long time. Ethan was a quiet boy. Ever since his mother passed away, he had become distant and withdrawn. No matter how many toys, gadgets, or tutors Richard brought home, nothing seemed to bring his son joy. He barely smiled anymore. But now, in front of this ordinary girl, he was laughing like a child again. Richard watched quietly from the doorway. He noticed how patient Lena was. She repeated her hand movements slowly, waiting for Ethan to understand. When he got one wrong, she laughed softly and showed him again. Her voice was gentle, full of warmth, something the mansion had been missing for years. Look, I can say good morning now, Ethan said excitedly, waving his hands in a particular way. Lena clapped and smiled. Yes, that's perfect. You're really good at this. Richard tilted his head. Good morning? He thought. Is this some kind of game? A code? He listened closer but couldn't understand what they were saying. They weren't using words, at least not spoken ones. It was like a secret language only they understood. For a few minutes he just stood there, unsure of what to do. His pride told him to interrupt, to remind the maid's daughter of her place. But his heart, the part of him that still loved the sound of his son's laughter, told him to wait. So he stayed quiet, hidden behind the door, watching them. When the lesson ended, Lena packed up her small notebook and stood. I have to go help Mama with the kitchen now, she said softly. Ethan frowned. Can you come back later? I want to learn more. She smiled. Maybe after I finish helping her. As she walked past the door, Richard stepped aside quickly, so she wouldn't see him. He heard Ethan humming happily to himself. That alone was shocking. The boy who once sat silent for hours was now humming. Richard went back to his office, but he couldn't focus. The image of his son smiling wouldn't leave his mind. He remembered the way Lena used her hands, the strange signs, and the joy it brought Ethan. What was this language? Why did it feel so special? Later that day, when the maid Maria came to serve lunch, Richard noticed her daughter following quietly behind, carrying a tray. She gave Ethan a shy smile, and Ethan waved back using his hands instead of words. Richard stared in surprise. He wanted to ask questions, but something inside told him to wait and watch a little longer. The mansion, which had always been filled with silence, suddenly felt alive. Laughter echoed again from the study room later that evening. The sound warmed the cold marble halls in a way no expensive decoration ever could. As night fell, Richard found himself standing outside Ethan's door once more, listening to that laughter. For the first time in years, he smiled just a little. Something inside him whispered that this girl, this maid's daughter, was about to change everything. He didn't know how, but he could feel it. And while he didn't understand the strange hand signs or the words they whispered, he understood one thing very clearly. His son was happy again, and that was something money had never been able to buy. He turned away from the door with a thoughtful look in his eyes, unaware that this small, innocent friendship between his son and the maid's daughter would soon reveal a truth so powerful. It would leave him speechless. The next morning started quietly, just like always. The sound of the gardener trimming the roses came from outside, and the smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. Mr. Richard Hale sat in his office, reading through a pile of papers. But his mind was not focused on business today. Every time he tried to read, he kept remembering what he had seen the day before. His son Ethan laughing and learning from the maid's daughter, Lena. He could still picture their smiles, the way Ethan's eyes had shined, and the strange way they had moved their hands while talking. Richard couldn't stop thinking about it. It wasn't something he understood, but it had made his son happy, and that alone made him curious. After finishing his coffee, he decided to go see Ethan's tutor to make sure the boy was studying properly. But when he reached the study room, he froze again. The tutor wasn't there. Instead, Lena was sitting on the floor with Ethan once more, both of them facing each other with notebooks open. Lena was showing him pictures she had drawn. Simple drawings of animals, people, and objects, and next to each picture were small hand symbols. Ethan copied her movements carefully, concentrating hard. "Remember," Lena said kindly. "This means thank you." She made a gesture with her hand. Ethan smiled and repeated it. "Like this." "Yes, perfect," she said, laughing. Richard stayed behind the half-open door again, silently watching. He could feel his usual anger rising. Not because Lena was doing anything wrong, but because he didn't understand what was happening. This was his son's study room, not a playground. He had hired the best teachers in the country to help Ethan, and yet none of them had ever made him this focused or this joyful. He folded his arms, leaning against the wall, listening closely. Lena continued, her voice calm and patient. "Do you know why I'm teaching you this? Because it helps people speak without words. It's called sign language." Sign language. The words repeated in Richard's mind. He had heard about it before. A language for people who couldn't hear or speak properly. But why was Lena teaching that to his son? Ethan wasn't deaf. He could talk perfectly fine. So why this? Ethan looked up at her curiously. "But I can talk. Why do I need sign language?" Lena smiled softly. "Because sometimes people don't listen to words. They listen better when they see your hands, your eyes, your heart." Her answer was so simple, yet it felt powerful. Richard didn't completely understand it, but he could see how Ethan did. The boy's face lit up, and he nodded thoughtfully. For the next hour, Richard stood there, quietly observing. Lena was not teaching from a textbook, but she had a natural gift. She didn't rush him. She celebrated every small success. And the more she taught, the more comfortable Ethan became. At one point, Ethan made a small mistake and got embarrassed. He looked down, his hands trembling. But instead of scolding him, Lena reached out and smiled. "It's okay to be wrong sometimes," she said. "Do you know how many mistakes I made when I learned this? 1,000. But every mistake teaches you something new." Ethan looked at her with admiration. No one had ever told him that before. His teachers at school were strict, his father was always busy, and his nannies often scolded him for being too slow. But here, with Lena, he felt safe, free to try, fail, and try again. When Ethan laughed again, Richard felt something stir inside him, guilt mixed with pride. He realized he had not seen his son laugh freely like this since his wife had died. Back then, their home used to be filled with warmth and laughter. But after her passing, everything turned cold and quiet. He had buried himself in work, thinking that money could fill the emptiness. He bought toys, gadgets, and games for Ethan, hoping it would bring him joy. But the boy had only grown more silent. Now, watching Lena and Ethan together, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Suddenly, the tutor arrived at the door, holding his books. "Good morning, sir," he said politely. Richard snapped out of his thoughts and stepped aside quickly, not wanting the tutor to notice he'd been eavesdropping. "You're late," Richard said quietly. "I'm sorry, sir," the tutor replied. "I had some traffic issues." Richard nodded but said nothing else. He looked back through the door once more, just in time to see Ethan helping Lena pick up her papers. They were both laughing again, unaware that the billionaire standing just outside was silently watching them with a heart full of questions. That afternoon, Richard couldn't work. He sat at his desk, tapping his pen against the table. The more he thought about it, the more he wanted to know the truth. Why did Lena know sign language? Why was she teaching it to his son? And most importantly, why did his son seem happier with her than with anyone else? As evening came, he walked past the kitchen and saw Maria, the maid and Lena's mother, washing dishes. Lena stood beside her, drying plates. The two looked peaceful, talking softly to each other. Richard thought about calling Maria over to ask her, but he stopped himself. Something told him to wait. Maybe it wasn't time yet. That night, as he passed by Ethan's room, he noticed the door slightly open. Inside, Ethan was sitting at his desk, practicing the hand signs in front of a mirror. His face was full of excitement and pride. When he made a mistake, he laughed and tried again. For the first time, Richard saw a spark of determination in his son, something he hadn't seen in years. And it wasn't because of expensive lessons or fancy tutors. It was because of a simple girl with a kind heart, who taught him a language that needed no words. Richard smiled to himself and quietly closed the door. He didn't know it yet, but this small act of kindness from the maid's daughter would soon uncover a truth that would change his life forever. A truth that would make him see the world, and his son, in a completely new way. The next morning, Mr. Richard Hale was in a strange mood. He had spent most of the night thinking about what he had seen. His son learning sign language from the maid's daughter. It bothered him, not because it was wrong, but because he didn't understand why it was happening. He was a man who liked to be in control, who liked answers. And right now he had none. At breakfast, he sat at the long dining table while Maria, the maid, served him tea. She looked nervous, as she always did around him. He barely spoke to her, just nodded as she placed his cup down. But this time he didn't let her leave so quickly. "Maria," he said, his deep voice making her freeze. "Where is your daughter?" Maria stopped in her tracks and turned slowly. "Elena, sir? She's helping Ethan with his breakfast, I believe." "Helping him?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Or teaching him something?" Maria's hands trembled. "Teaching, sir?" she asked softly, pretending not to understand. Richard looked at her for a long moment. He could see the worry in her eyes. "Yes," he said slowly, "teaching. I saw her yesterday, in the study room. She was using her hands to communicate with my son." Maria's face turned pale. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Richard's tone hardened slightly. "I want to know what's going on, Maria. Why is your daughter teaching my son a strange language? Who told her she could?" Maria's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said quickly. "She didn't mean any harm. Please, don't be angry with her." "Then tell me the truth," Richard demanded. Maria looked down at the floor. She was only trying to help," she whispered. "Ethan seemed lonely, sir. He doesn't talk much, and she thought maybe teaching him something new would make him happy." "Happy?" Richard repeated, his voice full of disbelief. "That's not her job. I pay for tutors, not for—" He stopped suddenly when he remembered Ethan's laughter, the sparkle in his eyes when Lena was around. He took a deep breath and sat back in his chair. "Bring her here," he said quietly. "I want to speak with her." Maria nodded quickly and left the room, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. A few minutes later, Lena walked in. She stood by the door, her hands clasped together. Her braid was a little loose, and she looked down, avoiding his eyes. Richard studied her carefully. She didn't look scared, just calm, as if she had expected this moment. "Come closer," he said. She stepped forward slowly until she stood a few feet from him. "Do you know why I called you here?" he asked. She nodded slightly. "Because I was teaching Ethan, sir." "Without permission," he added. "Yes, sir," she said softly. "I'm sorry if I did something wrong." Richard leaned forward. "I saw what you were teaching him. That language, those signs. Where did you learn it? And why were you teaching my son?" Lena took a deep breath before answering. "I learned it when I was younger, sir. My brother couldn't hear or speak. We used sign language to talk to him. After he passed away, I kept practicing it so I wouldn't forget." Her voice trembled a little as she spoke, but her eyes stayed strong. "When I started helping Mama here, I noticed Ethan was quiet. Not because he couldn't talk, but because he didn't want to. He looked sad like my brother used to. So I thought maybe this would help him open up." Richard's expression softened, though he didn't show it much. "You think my son needs that kind of help?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "I don't think he's sick or anything, sir. But sometimes people don't speak because they don't feel heard. Sign language isn't just for those who can't talk. It's for anyone who wants to express something without words." For a moment, the room fell silent. Richard didn't know what to say. The words coming from this young girl were surprisingly deep. He had never thought of communication that way. "So," he said after a pause, "you're saying my son feels unheard?" Lena hesitated, then nodded again. "Maybe, sir. But when he learns a new sign, he smiles. He feels proud. It gives him confidence. And I think he feels closer to you when he learns." "Closer to me?" Richard repeated, surprised. "Yes," she said softly. "He told me he wants to show you what he learned. He wants you to see that he's doing something special. He wants you to be proud." Those words hit Richard like a wave. He turned away for a second, pretending to look out the window, hiding the emotion that rose in his chest. He had always loved his son, but he realized now how distant he had become. Work had taken most of his time, and grief had taken the rest. He cleared his throat and looked back at Lena. "You're a brave girl," he said quietly, "and honest." "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice small but steady. He stood up and walked around his desk. "But Lena," he continued, "next time you want to teach my son something, you come to me first. Understand?" "Yes, sir," she said quickly. Richard looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. "You may go now." She turned to leave, but as she reached the door, he spoke again. "Wait." She stopped and looked back. He sighed, his voice softer this time. "Lena, what did you mean when you said sign language is a way to be heard?" Lena gave a small smile. "It means sometimes, sir, the heart speaks louder than the mouth. You just have to learn how to listen." And with that, she left the room quietly, her simple shoes tapping softly on the marble floor. Richard stood there, speechless. For years, no one had ever spoken to him like that. Calmly, truthfully, from the heart. And the fact that it came from a maid's daughter made it even more surprising. He walked to the window and looked out at the garden where Ethan was playing. For the first time in a long while, he wondered if he had been listening to the wrong things all along. That evening, the sky outside the mansion was painted in soft orange and pink colors as the sun began to set. The servants moved quietly through the house, preparing dinner. But inside his large office, Mr. Richard Hale sat deep in thought. His mind kept going back to his conversation with Lena earlier that day. The way she had spoken, calm, honest, and full of meaning, had touched something in him. He had built his life around money, power, and control. But that young girl, with her simple words, had made him question everything. "Sometimes, the heart speaks louder than the mouth," she had said. Those words echoed in his head over and over again. After dinner, he decided to check on his son. He walked down the hallway and stopped outside Ethan's room. The door was half open. He saw Ethan sitting cross-legged on the floor again, practicing hand signs in front of the mirror. His little fingers moved slowly, sometimes clumsily, but his face was filled with joy. "Good evening, Ethan," Richard said gently. Ethan turned quickly, surprised to see his father. "Oh, hi, Dad." Richard stepped inside and smiled a little. "What are you doing?" Ethan's eyes sparkled. "I'm practicing what Lena taught me today. Do you want to see?" Richard nodded. "Of course." Ethan stood up, a little shy but proud. He made a few hand signs and then said softly, "This means thank you, and this one means family." Richard watched carefully, feeling something warm grow inside him. "That's impressive," he said. "You're learning fast." Ethan grinned. "Lena says I'm really good at it. She said I learn faster than most people." Richard smiled again, though a little sadness touched his heart. He realized how long it had been since he'd spent real time with his son. Talking, laughing, learning something together. This small girl had done more for Ethan in a few days than he had done in years. The next morning, Richard decided to talk to Lena again. But this time, he wanted to truly understand. He found her outside in the garden, helping her mother hang freshly washed clothes. She looked up when she saw him and quickly stood straight. "Sir," she said politely. "Relax," Richard said, waving his hand. "I just wanted to talk." Lena glanced at her mother, who gave her a small nod, and then stepped aside to face Richard. "You said you learned sign language because of your brother," Richard began. "Can you tell me more about that?" Lena nodded softly. "Yes, sir. My brother, Daniel, was born deaf. He couldn't hear or speak, but he was the happiest person I knew. Our parents couldn't afford special schools, so I learned from books and videos to help him communicate. He was my best friend." Her voice trembled a little, but she continued. "He used to say that silence wasn't scary if someone cared enough to listen. After he passed away, I promised myself I'd teach others what he taught me. How to listen without words." Richard's heart tightened. There was so much pain in her story, yet so much strength. He felt ashamed that he had judged her so quickly. "You've done something good for my son," he said quietly. "You've given him something that no tutor or therapist could." Lena looked surprised. "Thank you, sir. But I didn't really do anything special. Ethan just needed someone to listen, that's all. He's very smart, and he has a big heart." Richard smiled faintly. "You see him that way, but I was too busy to notice." Lena looked at him, hesitated, and then said softly, "He misses you, sir. He talks about you sometimes, how he wants to show you what he's learning. He wants you to be proud." Those words hit Richard deeply. He turned away, looking at the wide green garden where Ethan often played. For years, he had thought that giving his son everything money could buy would make him happy. But what his son had really wanted was his time and love. That evening, Richard made a decision. When Lena came to teach Ethan after lunch, he quietly walked into the room and sat at the back. Both Lena and Ethan looked surprised. "You don't mind if I join, do you?" Richard asked gently. Lena smiled and shook her head. "Of course not, sir." Ethan beamed with joy. "Dad, you can learn too. I'll teach you what I know." Richard chuckled. "All right, teacher. Show me." The next hour was something Richard would never forget. He tried copying their hand signs, often getting them wrong, which made Ethan laugh loudly. Even Lena couldn't help but giggle when he messed up. The sound of laughter filled the room, echoing through the quiet halls of the mansion. Something that hadn't happened in a long time. When the lesson ended, Ethan looked at his father proudly. "You did great, Dad." Richard smiled warmly. "I had good teachers." After Lena left for the day, Richard sat alone in the room, still thinking. He now understood what Lena had meant when she said sign language was a way to be heard. It wasn't about hands or signs. It was about connection. It was about understanding someone's heart without them even speaking. He realized then how much he had missed in his son's life because he hadn't been truly listening. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He stood by his bedroom window, looking at the stars. Memories of his late wife came flooding back. How she used to sit with Ethan for hours, listening to his stories, laughing with him. She had always said, "You can't raise a child with money alone, Richard. You have to give them your heart too." Now he understood what she meant. He whispered softly into the quiet night. You were right, my love. You were always right. The next morning, when Lena arrived, Richard greeted her kindly and said, From now on, you can teach Ethan whenever you want. You don't need my permission. Her eyes widened. Thank you, sir. But, he added with a small smile, you'll have one more student from now on me. Lena smiled brightly, and Ethan, who was standing nearby, clapped his hands excitedly. Yay! Dad's learning too. For the first time in years, Richard felt peace in his heart. He realized that sometimes the biggest lessons in life don't come from the rich or powerful. They come from those with the purest hearts. And that day, he silently thanked the maid's daughter for teaching him how to listen again. Days passed and the Hale mansion slowly began to change. The walls that once echoed with silence now carried soft laughter and warm voices. Even the servants noticed the difference. Mr. Richard Hale, who was once known for his cold and serious nature, seemed softer now. He smiled more often, spoke kindly, and sometimes even joined his son and Lena during their lessons. Every afternoon, Lena would come after helping her mother in the kitchen. Ethan would wait for her near the garden, his notebook in hand, excited to learn something new. Richard would sometimes stand by the window in his office, pretending to read, but in truth he was watching them. Seeing his son's happy face filled his heart with peace, a feeling he hadn't known for a long time. But not everything was perfect. Deep inside, Richard carried guilt. Guilt for being distant, for not realizing his son's struggles sooner. He began to think about all the times Ethan had tried to talk to him, only for him to say, Not now, I'm busy. Those words echoed in his head like tiny pieces of regret. One afternoon, Richard decided to talk to Ethan's teacher at school. He wanted to understand why his son was so quiet there. The teacher, Mrs. Green, looked surprised when Richard arrived in person. Mr. Hale, she said politely, what a pleasant surprise. I wanted to ask about my son, Richard said. How is he doing in class? Mrs. Green smiled gently. Ethan is a bright boy, but he doesn't participate much. He rarely talks to the other students. It's like he lives in his own little world. I've always felt he needed someone to help him come out of his shell. Richard nodded slowly, his chest tightening. Thank you, Mrs. Green, he said softly. I think I understand now. When he returned home that evening, he found Ethan and Lena sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by papers and crayons. They were drawing pictures and labeling them with hand signs. Richard quietly sat down beside them. What are you two working on? He asked with a small smile. Ethan looked up, his eyes bright. We're making a sign language storybook. Lena said we can make one with pictures and signs so I can remember better. Richard's heart swelled with pride. That's wonderful, he said. Can I see it? Lena handed him one of the papers. On it was a drawing of a boy and a man holding hands, with the word family written below and a sign symbol drawn next to it. Richard stared at the picture for a long time. His throat tightened, and he had to blink away the tears that tried to form. This is beautiful, he said finally. Lena smiled. Ethan made that one. He said it's his favorite word. Richard looked at his son, who was shyly smiling. Is that so? He asked softly. Ethan nodded. Because now it feels like a real family again. Those words broke through the last piece of coldness inside Richard's heart. He reached out, pulled his son close, and hugged him tightly. You're right, he whispered. It does. From that day on, Richard made a promise to himself. No matter how busy life got, he would never let work or pride keep him away from his son again. But while things were getting better for Richard and Ethan, Maria, the maid, began to worry. She had seen how close her daughter had become with the billionaire and his son. Every night, she reminded Lena, we work for them, sweetheart. Don't forget that. People like us don't belong in their world. Lena would smile softly and say, I know, Mama, but Ethan needs a friend. That's all. Still, Maria's heart was uneasy. She had seen the way people like Richard's rich friends treated her and others, with polite smiles that hid quiet judgment. She didn't want her daughter to get hurt. One afternoon, as Lena was leaving the study room, one of the mansion's guests, a wealthy business partner of Richard's, saw her. He frowned slightly. "Isn't that the maid's daughter?" he whispered to another man. "Why is she here with Ethan?" The other man shrugged. "Strange, isn't it? I heard she's been teaching the boy something. Maybe the billionaire's losing his mind, letting servants teach his son." Richard overheard them from the hallway. The word stung, but he didn't respond. Instead, he quietly walked past them, his expression calm but his mind deep in thought. He realized how cruel people's judgments could be. But he also knew the truth, that this young girl had brought more happiness and healing into his home than any doctor or expensive tutor ever could. That night, when the guests had left, Richard called Lena and Maria to his office. They looked nervous, thinking something was wrong. "Don't worry," Richard said with a kind smile. "I just wanted to thank you both." "Thank us, sir?" Maria asked, confused. "Yes," he said. "Your daughter has done something no one else could. She helped my son smile again. She reminded me what truly matters. For that, I'll always be grateful." Lena looked down shyly. "I didn't do it alone, sir. Ethan helped me too. We both learned together." Richard smiled. "Yes, you did. And I'm proud of both of you." When they left the room, Maria's eyes were filled with tears. Not of sadness, but of relief. For the first time, she saw real kindness in the eyes of a rich man. That night, Richard went to tuck Ethan into bed. As he leaned down to kiss his forehead, Ethan signed something with his little hands. Richard smiled, recognizing the sign. "I love you too, son." Ethan's eyes sparkled. "You remembered. I'll never forget again," Richard said softly. He turned off the light and quietly left the room, his heart finally at peace. The house that was once filled with silence was now alive again. Not because of wealth, but because of love, kindness, and a language that needed no words. As he walked to his room, Richard whispered to himself, "Sometimes, the smallest people teach the biggest lessons." He knew then that his life and his heart would never be the same again. The days continued to pass, and the bond between Ethan and Lena grew stronger with each one. Richard often found them laughing in the garden or sitting under the big oak tree, their notebooks open, drawing signs and pictures together. The mansion, which once felt cold and empty, now felt alive again. The servants smiled more, the air seemed lighter, and even Richard himself felt a kind of peace he hadn't known in years. But life has a strange way of testing happiness. One evening, Richard received a call from his company's board of directors. There had been a problem. A financial crisis was unfolding. He was needed in New York immediately. He sighed deeply, feeling the familiar pull of work dragging him away from the peace he had just found. The next morning, as he prepared to leave, Ethan clung to his father's arm. "Don't go, Dad," he whispered. "Please stay." Richard knelt down and held his son close. "I have to, buddy. But I promise I'll be back soon. And you can keep practicing with Lena. Okay?" Ethan nodded, but his eyes were filled with sadness. Lena stood nearby, quiet, holding Ethan's notebook. "Don't worry, sir," she said softly. "I'll take care of him." Richard smiled gratefully. "I know you will." When Richard left for his trip, the mansion felt different again. Ethan tried to be cheerful, but without his father around, he became quieter. Maria noticed and told Lena, "Maybe let him rest for a few days. He misses his father." But Lena shook her head gently. "He needs something to keep him happy. I'll think of something special." That night, as she sat in her small room beside her mother, Lena began to draw. She stayed up late, creating new sign cards and colorful pictures, things she thought might cheer Ethan up. She wanted to make him smile again, the way he used to when his father was home. The next day, she surprised him. "Let's make a play," she said excitedly. "A play?" Ethan asked, his eyes lighting up. "Yes," she said. "A story. We'll use signs and drawings. You can be the hero, and I'll be your helper." Ethan giggled. "Okay, what's the story about?" "It's about a little boy who teaches the world a new language," Lena replied. "A language of love and kindness." They spent the whole day preparing their little play. They cut out paper crowns, drew castles, and practiced their lines in both voice and signs. The servants gathered in the evening to watch them perform in the garden. Ethan stood proudly in front, his small hands moving gracefully as he signed his words. Everyone clapped and cheered, and for a moment, all the sadness in his heart disappeared. Maria watched from the side, her heart swelling with pride. She couldn't believe how much her daughter had done for the young boy, how much light she had brought into this grand but lonely home. Meanwhile, in New York, Richard was sitting in a large conference room surrounded by serious faces and endless charts. But no matter how hard he tried to focus, his mind kept drifting back home. He missed Ethan's laughter, Lena's cheerful voice, and the warmth that now filled his mansion. Late that night, after a long meeting, he opened his phone and found a video message from Maria. She had filmed Ethan and Lena's little play. He pressed play, and within seconds, his tired face broke into a smile. There was Ethan, wearing a paper crown, signing confidently, while Lena stood beside him, smiling proudly. At the end of the play, Ethan looked at the camera and signed something that made Richard's eyes fill with tears. "I love you, Dad." Ethan signed slowly, then waved at the camera. Richard couldn't hold back his emotions. In that moment, he realized no amount of success or money could ever replace what he had waiting for him at home. He immediately booked the earliest flight back. The next morning, the mansion was quiet when a car pulled up outside. Lena was in the garden helping Maria hang laundry when she saw Richard step out of the car. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Sir, you're back already?" Richard smiled. "I couldn't stay away." He walked inside and found Ethan asleep on the couch, his little hands resting on his chest. Richard sat beside him and gently brushed his hair. Ethan stirred, then blinked awake, and when he saw his father, his face lit up with pure joy. "Dad!" he shouted, jumping into his father's arms. Richard hugged him tightly. "I saw your play," he said softly. "You were amazing." Ethan giggled. "Did you like the ending?" "I loved it," Richard replied. "It was the best thing I've ever seen." Lena stood quietly nearby, smiling. Richard turned to her. "You've done more for my son than anyone ever has." "Thank you, Lena." She looked down shyly. "I just wanted him to be happy, sir." "And you made him happier than I ever could," Richard said honestly. "You reminded me what's important." For the next few days, Richard stayed home, spending time with his son and even joining their lessons. He learned a few signs himself and practiced them with Ethan every night. The house was once again filled with laughter and love, stronger than before. One evening, as they sat together under the oak tree, Richard asked Lena, "Who taught you sign language, Lena?" She looked up at the sky and said softly, "My father. Before he passed away, he was deaf. I used to talk to him through signs. That's how I learned." Richard was silent for a moment. He understood now why she had connected so deeply with Ethan. She wasn't just teaching him. She was sharing a part of her heart. "Your father must have been very proud of you," Richard said gently. Lena smiled faintly. "I hope so." Richard nodded. "I'm sure he was. And I want you to know, I'm proud of you too." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. No one had ever said that to her before. As the sun began to set behind them, painting the sky in warm gold, the three of them, a billionaire, his son, and the maid's daughter, sat together under the tree. They didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of love, gratitude, and peace. It was a silence that spoke louder than words ever could. A few weeks passed peacefully after Richard returned home. The mansion was full of laughter and light again. Every morning, Ethan would wake up early, run to Lena's small study corner, and excitedly start his lessons. They would spend hours learning new words, drawing pictures, and creating their own signs for fun. Sometimes, even Richard would join them after work, trying to copy their gestures and laughing when he made mistakes. But one evening, everything changed. It was a quiet night. The sky was clear, and the stars were shining brightly. Maria and Lena were helping in the kitchen when suddenly, Ethan began to cough badly in the living room. At first, it sounded like a small cough, but soon it grew stronger. His face turned pale, and his breathing became heavy. Lena rushed to his side, panic filling her chest. "Ethan, are you okay?" she cried, touching his forehead. He was burning with fever. Maria ran to call Richard. Within minutes, he came rushing down the stairs, his face full of fear. He picked Ethan up in his arms and said, "We're going to the hospital right now." The driver started the car, and they sped through the streets, the sound of the siren filling the night. Lena sat in the back seat, holding Ethan's hand, whispering softly, "You'll be okay, Ethan. Just breathe. I'm right here." At the hospital, doctors quickly took Ethan inside. Richard tried to follow, but a nurse stopped him. "Please wait here, sir." He stood frozen in the hallway, helpless, watching as the doors closed. Maria and Lena stood beside him, both praying silently. Hours passed like days. The clock ticked slowly, and every minute felt heavier than the last. Finally, a doctor came out, his face serious. "Mr. Hale," he said quietly, "your son's condition is stable for now, but we discovered something concerning." Richard's heart sank. "What do you mean?" The doctor sighed. "Ethan has a weak immune system. The stress and lack of emotional connection he experienced for years may have affected his health. We'll need to keep him under observation." Richard felt guilt wash over him like a wave. His knees weakened and he had to sit down. "It's my fault," he whispered. "I was never there for him when he needed me." Lena stepped forward softly. "It's not your fault, sir. You're here now, and that's what matters." The doctor looked at Lena curiously. "You're the one who's been helping him communicate?" Lena nodded shyly. "Yes, sir. I teach him sign language." The doctor smiled faintly. "Then you've done something incredible. His emotional progress is what's keeping him strong right now. Keep doing what you're doing. It helps more than you know." Richard looked at her with tears in his eyes. "Thank you, Lena," he whispered. "You saved my son's heart, and maybe his life." Ethan had to stay in the hospital for several days. Richard refused to leave his side. He worked from the hospital room, answering calls and signing papers while holding his son's hand. Lena visited every morning with small cards and drawings. She'd sit beside Ethan's bed, teaching him signs while he smiled weakly, his little fingers moving slowly but proudly. One day, while Richard stepped out to speak to the doctor, Ethan looked at Lena and signed something. She watched his hands carefully and smiled. "You want me to teach you something new?" Ethan shook his head and signed again. Slowly. It took her a moment. Then her eyes filled with tears. He had signed, "You are my sister." Lena couldn't stop the tears that rolled down her cheeks. She hugged him gently, whispering, "And you are my little brother." When Richard came back, he saw them together and smiled faintly. But deep down, he was worried. The doctors had said Ethan might take a long time to fully recover, and any strong emotional shock could make things worse. He didn't want to lose him, not again. The next morning, Maria came to visit and found Richard sitting outside the hospital room, staring blankly at the floor. "Sir," she said softly, "are you all right?" He looked up, his eyes tired. "Maria, I can't thank you enough for what your daughter has done. She's like an angel to us. But I'm afraid for Ethan. I don't know what I'd do if anything happened to him." Maria put a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're doing everything you can, sir. And Lena, she won't stop until he's better. She has a heart full of love. That's what your boy needs most." Richard nodded slowly. He felt tears sting his eyes again. For years, he had believed money could solve everything. But now, sitting in a hospital hallway with a simple maid and her daughter, he realized how wrong he had been. A few days later, Ethan's fever finally began to drop. The doctors said he was getting better. Everyone breathed in relief. When they returned home, Richard decided to do something special. He gathered everyone in the mansion, the staff, Maria, and Lena. "I have an announcement," he said, his voice warm. "From today, Lena will not just be helping as a teacher. She will be part of this family, officially." Lena looked shocked. "Sir, what do you mean?" Richard smiled. I mean, you'll have access to the same education as Ethan. You'll study, learn, and grow just like him. I'll take care of everything. Maria's eyes filled with tears. Sir, that's too much. We can't accept. Yes, you can, Richard interrupted kindly. You both have done more for us than money can ever repay. Let me do this. Lena's lips trembled. Thank you, sir. I don't know what to say. Richard smiled warmly. Just promise me one thing. Never stop teaching, and never stop believing in kindness. From that day, the Hale Mansion became more than just a home for a rich man. It became a place of hope, healing, and love. Ethan's laughter returned. He and Lena studied side by side, learning new words, new signs, and even new dreams. Sometimes, Richard would sit in his office and watch them through the glass window, the two children who had changed his world. He would smile to himself and whisper, "Maybe this is what real wealth looks like." He finally understood that happiness doesn't come from success or luxury. It comes from love, compassion, and the people who teach you to feel again. Months passed, and life inside the Hale Mansion became more peaceful and full of love than ever before. Ethan's health had improved, his laughter filled every corner of the house, and his bond with Lena grew even stronger. Every morning, he would run down the grand staircase, calling out for her, ready to learn something new. Lena, now officially studying under Richard's support, balanced her school and her time with Ethan perfectly. She was no longer just the maid's daughter, she was family. Richard often found himself watching the two children with quiet admiration. He had seen Ethan transform from a shy, lonely boy into a confident, happy child. And all of it happened because of one kind-hearted girl who had given his son more than words. She had given him courage, love, and connection. One sunny afternoon, Richard decided to surprise them. He walked into the garden, where Ethan and Lena were sitting under the old oak tree. They were drawing again, as always using colorful markers and papers. Richard held a small envelope in his hand. "Hey, you two," he said with a smile. "I have something special." Ethan looked up, his eyes bright. "What is it, Dad?" Richard sat down beside them. "It's a surprise for Lena." Lena looked confused. "For me, sir?" He nodded and handed her the envelope. "Open it." She opened it carefully and pulled out a letter. As her eyes moved across the paper, they widened in disbelief. It was a scholarship, a full scholarship to one of the best schools in the city. "Sir, I don't understand," she stammered. "You're sending me to this school?" Richard smiled kindly. "You've earned it, Lena. You've worked hard, helped my son, and changed our lives. You deserve the best education you can get." Tears filled her eyes. She had never imagined something like this could happen to her. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "You've done so much for us already." Richard shook his head. "No, Lena. You did this. You gave us something money could never buy. It's my turn to thank you." Ethan suddenly hugged her tightly. "You'll be the best student ever," he said proudly. Lena laughed softly, hugging him back. "Only if you promise to keep studying too." "I will," he said, making a small sign for promise with his hand. One of the first signs she ever taught him. The following weeks were filled with excitement and a little sadness too. Lena was preparing to start her new school, and though she would still live at the mansion, she would be gone most of the day. Ethan tried to be brave about it, but deep down he didn't want her to go. On her first day, Maria helped her get ready. She wore a simple but neat uniform, her hair tied back, her backpack neatly packed with books and pencils. As she stood at the gate, ready to leave, Richard and Ethan were there to see her off. Richard smiled proudly. "Go make us proud, Lena." "I will, sir," she said softly. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes shining. He signed, "Don't forget me." She bent down and smiled. "Never," she signed back. As she walked away, Richard put a hand on his son's shoulder. "She'll always be part of our lives, Ethan, no matter where she goes." Days turned into weeks, and Lena quickly became one of the top students at her new school. She impressed everyone with her intelligence, kindness, and determination. But every evening, she came home to the Hale Mansion, where Ethan waited for her eagerly with stories to tell and new signs to show. Sometimes they would sit by the window and watch the stars just like before. Ethan would point to the brightest one and say, "That one's yours, Lena, because you're the brightest person I know." She would laugh softly and reply, "Then that one's yours, because you light up the dark." Meanwhile, Richard had become a completely changed man. He no longer spent endless nights buried in work. Instead, he made time for family dinners, walks in the garden, and bedtime stories. His employees noticed he smiled more often, and his friends couldn't believe the difference in him. One evening, a business associate asked him, "Richard, what happened to you? You used to live only for your work. Now you look happy." Richard smiled and replied, "I used to think success was about money, but then a little girl taught me that success is about love, kindness, and the lives we touch." The man looked puzzled, but Richard didn't explain further. Some lessons, he knew, could only be understood through the heart. Years began to pass. Ethan grew stronger, taller, and more confident. He continued learning sign language and even helped organize awareness events at school to support children with communication challenges. Lena, too, continued to shine. She graduated with honors and earned a scholarship to study linguistics. Her dream was to become a teacher and help more children like Ethan. When she told Richard and Maria about her plan, both of them were overcome with pride. "You've come so far, my dear," Maria said with tears in her eyes. Richard smiled warmly. "You've changed our lives, Lena, and now you'll change many more." Before leaving for university, Lena spent her last evening at the Hale mansion sitting with Ethan under their favorite oak tree. The air was warm, the sky painted in orange and pink. Ethan looked at her with sad eyes. "Will you come back?" he asked quietly. Lena smiled, brushing his hair from his face. "Of course I will. This is my home too." He nodded, trying not to cry. "Promise." She made the sign for promise again, the same one they had shared years ago. "Promise." As she walked toward the car, Richard called out, "Lena." She turned around. "Yes, sir." He smiled. "No matter where you go or what you achieve, remember this. You'll always have a family here." Her eyes filled with tears again, and she nodded. "I'll never forget." As the car drove away, Ethan waved until it disappeared down the road. Richard stood beside him, his heart full. He looked up at the sky and whispered softly, "Thank you, God, for sending her into our lives." The wind blew gently through the trees, carrying the sound of laughter that still lingered in the garden. A reminder of how one simple act of kindness had changed everything. The mansion that was once filled with silence had become a home full of love, hope, and meaning. And though years would pass, one truth remained forever. Sometimes, the smallest people, like a maid's daughter, teach the biggest lessons and leave behind a story the world will never forget.